In the dimly lit chambers of the Palazzo Vecchio, where shadows danced across ancient stone walls and the weight of Florentine politics hung heavy in the air, Niccolò Machiavelli understood a truth that would echo through centuries: the man who can walk away from everything possesses the ultimate weapon. Not the sword, not gold, not even the loyalty of armies, but something far more potent: the ability to remain unshackled by desire, untethered by need, and unmoved by loss. This was not merely philosophical musing born from the comfort of scholarly reflection. It was a principle forged in the crucible of Renaissance politics, where princes rose and fell with the changing tides of fortune, where alliances shifted like sand in an hourglass, and where survival demanded a particular kind of psychological armor that few possessed and even fewer understood. The court of Lorenzo de' Medici provided Machiavelli with countless examples of this principle in action. He observed how those who clung too tightly to their positions, their wealth, their relationships, invariably found themselves at the mercy of those who held such things lightly. The desperate are predictable, and the predictable are vulnerable. When a man's happiness, security, or identity depends entirely on external circumstances beyond his control, he becomes a puppet dancing to strings pulled by others who recognize his dependencies and exploit them without mercy. Consider the merchant prince who built his empire through shrewd calculation and careful risk management, only to lose everything because he could not bear the thought of temporary setbacks. His attachment to his accumulated wealth became his weakness. When competitors threatened his trade routes, when political winds shifted against his interests, when economic downturns challenged his enterprises, his inability to accept potential loss paralyzed his decision-making. He held on too long, invested too heavily in failing ventures, and refused to cut his losses when wisdom demanded retreat. His empire crumbled not because he lacked skill or intelligence, but because he had forgotten the fundamental truth that attachment breeds vulnerability. The psychological architecture of detachment operates on multiple levels, each more sophisticated than the last. At its most basic level, detachment means maintaining emotional distance from outcomes. The man who can walk away understands that his sense of self-worth cannot be dependent on any single relationship, position, or possession. This creates an unassailable position in negotiations, conflicts, and competitions because his opponents cannot leverage what he does not need. But true Machiavellian detachment goes deeper than mere emotional control. It requires a fundamental restructuring of how one perceives value and meaning. The attached man sees the world through the lens of what he might lose. The detached man sees it through the lens of what he might gain. This shift in perspective transforms every interaction from a defensive struggle to maintain what is, into an offensive exploration of what could be. In the political arena, this principle manifested with startling clarity. Machiavelli observed how princes who ruled from a position of desperate attachment to their thrones made decisions based on fear rather than strategy. They surrounded themselves with yes-men who told them what they wanted to hear, rather than advisors who told them what they needed to know. They avoided necessary but risky reforms because they feared the temporary instability such changes might bring. They held on to failing policies because admitting error felt like admitting weakness. Contrast this with the prince who held his throne lightly, who understood that power was not a possession to be hoarded but a tool to be wielded. Such a ruler could make the difficult decisions that attached leaders could not. He could sacrifice short-term popularity for long-term stability, could abandon failing strategies without ego getting in the way, could even abdicate if circumstances demanded it, knowing that voluntary retreat often preserves more than desperate last stands. The merchant guilds of Florence provided another laboratory for observing these principles. The most successful traders were those who understood that every market position was temporary, every partnership provisional, every opportunity fleeting. They held their business relationships with professional warmth but personal distance, ready to shift alliances when market conditions changed. They diversified not just their investments but their emotional investments, never allowing their sense of identity to become too closely tied to any single venture. These merchants understood what modern behavioral economics would later confirm: loss aversion is one of the most powerful cognitive biases affecting human decision-making. People typically fear losses more than they value equivalent gains, leading them to make suboptimal choices to avoid losing what they already have. The merchant who can walk away from a deal is negotiating from a position of strength because he is not psychologically anchored to any particular outcome. The same principle applied in matters of love and friendship. Machiavelli noted how those who pursued relationships from a position of desperate need invariably found themselves in relationships characterized by imbalance and manipulation. The lover who cannot bear to be alone becomes the lover who tolerates disrespect. The friend who fears abandonment becomes the friend who accepts exploitation. The son who craves paternal approval becomes the son who sacrifices his own values to maintain peace. But, the man who could walk away from any relationship operated from an entirely different foundation. His relationships were chosen rather than needed, characterized by mutual respect rather than mutual dependency. This did not make him cold or calculating in his personal connections, but rather more genuinely warm because his warmth came from choice rather than compulsion. The psychological freedom that comes from this kind of detachment creates what could be called strategic optionality. The attached man has limited options because he must factor in the preservation of what he already has. The detached man has unlimited options because he can consider any course of action without being constrained by fear of loss. This freedom to act, to choose, to walk away, becomes its own form of power that others inevitably recognize and respect. In the diplomatic sphere, Machiavelli witnessed how ambassadors and negotiators who operated from this principle of detachment consistently achieved better outcomes than their more invested counterparts. They could make credible threats because they were genuinely prepared to follow through. They could explore creative solutions because they were not locked into predetermined positions. They could recognize when negotiations had reached an impasse and walk away before wasting further time and resources. The ability to walk away also fundamentally changes the nature of commitment. Paradoxically, the man who can leave at any time often makes deeper and more meaningful commitments than the man who feels trapped. His commitments are chosen daily rather than assumed permanently, making them more valuable precisely because they are more voluntary. The wife who knows her husband could leave but chooses to stay feels more loved than the wife who believes her husband has no choice. The employee who knows the boss could fire him but chooses to invest in his development feels more valued than the employee who believes his position is secure regardless of performance. This principle extends into every area where power dynamics operate. The student who can walk away from a particular educational path has more leverage with teachers and administrators than the student who feels trapped in a system. The citizen who can emigrate has more influence on government policy than the citizen who feels bound to accept whatever conditions are imposed. The artist who can abandon a particular style or medium has more creative freedom than the artist who has invested too heavily in a single approach. But, perhaps the most profound application of this principle lies in the relationship between the individual and his own identity. Most people construct their sense of self around external markers, their job title, their relationship status, their possessions, their social standing. This makes them vulnerable to any threat to these external supports. The man who can walk away from everything has learned to construct his identity around internal qualities that cannot be taken from him: his principles, his skills, his character, his ability to adapt and overcome. This internal foundation creates what could be called sovereign selfhood. The sovereign self is not dependent on external validation or circumstances for its sense of worth and identity. It can engage fully with the world without being enslaved by the world. It can love without possessiveness, work without desperation, compete without despair, and lead without neediness. The development of this sovereign selfhood requires a particular kind of discipline and practice. It means regularly examining the attachments that constrain choice and decision-making. It means deliberately placing oneself in situations where walking away is an option, not to become cold and calculating, but to maintain the freedom that makes genuine warmth and generosity possible. It means cultivating skills and resources that provide independence, not for the sake of isolation, but for the sake of choosing connection freely. The man who has mastered this art of strategic detachment becomes paradoxically more attractive to others rather than less. People are drawn to those who seem complete in themselves, who offer their time and attention as gifts rather than debts. Leadership naturally flows toward those who do not desperately seek it, wealth accumulates around those who are not enslaved by it, and love flourishes with those who do not demand it. But this path requires confronting one of the deepest human fears, the fear of being alone, unwanted, unnecessary. Most attachments are rooted in this fundamental anxiety about our own worth and place in the world. The journey toward strategic detachment is ultimately a journey toward self-acceptance so complete that external validation becomes welcome but unnecessary, external support helpful but not essential, external love appreciated but not demanded. The Renaissance courts taught Machiavelli that this principle operated at every level of human interaction, from the most intimate personal relationships to the grandest political alliances. Those who mastered the art of walking away did not become hermits or sociopaths, they became the most powerful and effective people in their spheres of influence because they operated from freedom rather than fear, from choice rather than compulsion, from strength rather than neediness. Part 2, The Destruction of the Weak Self. The second revelation that emerged from Machiavelli's observations was perhaps even more profound than the first. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This was not a metaphorical destruction but a deliberate, systematic dismantling of every internal weakness that could be exploited by external forces. In an age where political survival meant psychological warfare as much as military strategy, this principle separated those who merely endured from those who truly conquered. The weak self is not the gentle self or the compassionate self, it is the self that operates from fear, insecurity, and unexamined assumptions. It is the collection of automatic responses, inherited beliefs, and unconscious patterns that make a person predictable and, therefore, vulnerable. The weak self seeks comfort over growth, approval over truth, and safety over opportunity. Most dangerously, the weak self mistakes its limitations for its identity, defending its weaknesses as if they were virtues. In the papal courts of Rome, Machiavelli observed how certain cardinals and bishops had cultivated such refined political senses that they seemed immune to the usual forms of manipulation and coercion. These men had not become cold or cruel, rather, they had systematically identified and eliminated every internal vulnerability that could be used against them. They had studied their own fears, mapped their emotional triggers, and practiced until their responses became matters of choice rather than reflex. One such figure was Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, who would later become Pope Julius II. Della Rovere had learned early in his career that his quick temper and pride could be exploited by opponents who knew how to provoke him into unwise actions. Rather than simply trying to control these tendencies, he embarked on a systematic program of self-reconstruction. He deliberately placed himself in situations designed to trigger his anger, practicing new responses until they became automatic. He studied his pride, identifying exactly what circumstances made him most defensive, and developed strategies for maintaining objectivity even when his ego was under attack. The process was not one of suppression but of transformation. Della Rovere did not try to eliminate his passionate nature, instead, he learned to direct that passion strategically rather than reactively. His anger became a tool he could deploy when it served his purposes rather than an emotion that controlled his behavior. His pride became a source of high standards rather than a vulnerability to flattery and insult. This transformation required what could be called radical self-honesty. Most people live with comfortable self-deceptions that protect their ego but limit their effectiveness. They avoid examining their real motivations, deny their genuine weaknesses, and rationalize their failures rather than learning from them. The process of destroying the weak self demands the opposite approach, ruthless examination of every aspect of one's character, motivation, and behavior pattern. The banking houses of Florence provided another laboratory for observing this principle. The Medici family's rise to power was not just a matter of financial acumen but of psychological sophistication. They understood that business success required more than technical skill. It required the ability to read people accurately, negotiate from strength, and maintain composure under pressure. Each generation of Medici leaders was trained not just in accounting and trade but in the systematic development of psychological resilience. Lorenzo the Magnificent exemplified this approach. From childhood, he was deliberately exposed to criticism, setbacks, and challenges designed to identify and strengthen his weak points. When he showed a tendency toward vanity about his poetry, his tutors arranged for harsh but fair critiques from respected scholars. When he displayed overconfidence in negotiations, experienced merchants were brought in to outmaneuver him in practice sessions. Every weakness was treated not as a character flaw to be hidden but as a vulnerability to be eliminated through training and practice. The weak self operates through a series of unconscious patterns that make behavior predictable. The man who always responds to criticism with defensiveness can be manipulated by anyone who understands this pattern. The leader who cannot tolerate being wrong will be fed information that confirms his biases rather than challenges his assumptions. The lover who fears abandonment will tolerate treatment that a more secure person would reject. These patterns create invisible chains that others can use to control and manipulate. Destroying the weak self means breaking these chains through conscious choice and deliberate practice. It requires developing what philosophers would later call metacognition, the ability to observe one's own thought processes and emotional responses with enough detachment to choose different reactions. The man who can watch his own anger arise and choose whether or not to express it has achieved a level of self-mastery that makes him nearly invulnerable to emotional manipulation. But this process must be distinguished from mere emotional suppression or stoic withdrawal. The goal is not to become unfeeling but to become freely feeling, able to experience the full range of human emotions without being enslaved by them. The destroyed weak self is replaced not by emptiness but by conscious choice in every moment. Every response becomes deliberate rather than automatic, strategic rather than merely reactive. The military campaigns that Machiavelli studied provided numerous examples of how this principle operated in life and death situations. The most effective commanders were those who had systematically eliminated every psychological weakness that could compromise their judgment. They had practiced making difficult decisions under extreme pressure until such choices became matters of trained capability rather than emotional struggle. They had studied their own fears and developed strategies for functioning effectively despite them. Caesar's conquest of Gaul demonstrated this principle repeatedly. Caesar had identified in himself a tendency toward overconfidence that could lead to inadequate preparation and reckless decision-making. Rather than denying this weakness, he developed systematic checks and balances to counteract it. He surrounded himself with advisors specifically chosen for their willingness to challenge his assumptions. He instituted regular reviews of his strategies that required him to articulate the potential flaws in his plans. He practiced considering worst-case scenarios until pessimistic analysis became as natural as optimistic projection. The weak self often disguises itself as virtue or necessity. The person who cannot say no claims to be helpful and accommodating. The individual who avoids conflict presents himself as peace-loving. The leader who refuses to make hard decisions portrays himself as thoughtful and democratic. These self-deceptions prevent the recognition that is necessary for growth and change. Destroying the weak self requires cutting through these comfortable rationalizations to examine the real motivations and consequences of behavior patterns. The helpful person who cannot say no might discover that his helpfulness is actually a form of control, an attempt to make others dependent on him. The conflict-avoiding individual might realize that her peace-loving nature is actually cowardice that allows problems to fester and grow. The indecisive leader might acknowledge that his democratic approach is actually a way to avoid responsibility for difficult choices. This kind of self-examination can be brutal, but it is also liberating. Each weakness that is honestly acknowledged and systematically addressed becomes a source of strength rather than vulnerability. The former people-pleaser who learns to set boundaries becomes more genuinely helpful because his help comes from choice rather than compulsion. The former conflict avoider who develops the capacity for difficult conversations becomes a more effective peacemaker because she can address problems before they escalate. The process of destroying the weak self also involves what could be called ego demolition and reconstruction. The ego is not inherently problematic, but most people's egos are built on shaky foundations: the need for approval, the fear of failure, the desire to appear competent rather than to actually be competent. These ego structures create vulnerabilities that others can exploit. Machiavelli observed how certain courtiers had learned to periodically dismantle and rebuild their sense of identity based on more solid foundations. They would deliberately seek out situations that challenged their self-image, actively pursue feedback that revealed their blind spots, and regularly question their most basic assumptions about themselves and the world. This was not self-abuse but self-development carried out with the same systematic approach that a master craftsman might use to perfect his art. The weak self is also characterized by rigid thinking patterns that limit adaptability. Most people develop mental models of how the world works and, then, defend these models even when evidence contradicts them. They become invested in being right rather than being effective, in maintaining consistency rather than pursuing truth. This rigidity makes them predictable and, therefore, manipulable. Destroying the weak self means developing what could be called cognitive flexibility, the ability to hold beliefs lightly enough to change them when circumstances warrant. This does not mean becoming wishy-washy or unprincipled, but rather distinguishing between core values that should remain constant and tactical beliefs that should evolve with experience and evidence. The man who has destroyed his weak self can admit error without feeling diminished, can change his mind without feeling inconsistent, and can adopt new strategies without feeling like he is betraying his identity. The social dynamics of Renaissance Italy provided countless opportunities to observe how this principle played out in interpersonal relationships. Those who had successfully destroyed their weak selves interacted with others from a position of centered strength rather than defensive insecurity. They could give honest feedback without cruelty, receive criticism without defensiveness, and maintain their own standards without imposing them on others. These individuals became natural leaders not because they sought power but because they operated from a level of psychological integration that others instinctively recognized and respected. Their confidence was not the brittle confidence of the insecure person trying to prove himself, but the quiet confidence of someone who knows his own capabilities and limitations. Their charisma was not the desperate charm of someone seeking approval, but the natural magnetism of someone who was genuinely comfortable in his own skin. The destruction of the weak self ultimately enables what could be called authentic power. Most of what people call power is actually a form of compensation for felt weakness, the loud voice that masks insecurity, the rigid control that stems from fear, the accumulation of possessions or positions that substitute for genuine self-worth. True power flows from the elimination of internal contradictions and the alignment of thought, feeling, and action. The man who has destroyed his weak self operates from integrated strength rather than compensatory weakness. His power does not depend on diminishing others because it comes from his own development rather than relative comparison. His confidence does not require external validation because it is based on genuine capability rather than manufactured image. His influence flows naturally from his authenticity rather than being forced through manipulation or coercion. Part 3, the synthesis of invulnerability. The convergence of these two principles, the ability to walk away from anything and the destruction of the weak self, creates a form of human invulnerability that transcends mere physical or financial security. This is not the invulnerability of the fortress, which can be besieged, but the invulnerability of water, which cannot be grasped, cannot be broken, and always finds its way around obstacles. In the treacherous landscape of Renaissance politics, those who achieved this synthesis became forces of nature rather than mere players in the game. Machiavelli's most profound insights emerged from studying individuals who had successfully integrated both principles into a unified approach to life and power. These rare figures operated with a kind of fluid strength that made them nearly impossible to defeat because they could not be cornered, could not be predicted, and could not be broken. They had achieved what could be called strategic invincibility not through superior force but through superior adaptability and self-mastery. The synthesis begins with understanding that detachment and self-destruction are not separate processes but two aspects of the same transformation. Walking away from external attachments becomes possible only when the internal weaknesses that create those attachments have been eliminated. Conversely, destroying the weak self naturally leads to detachment because the ego structures that create desperate clinging have been dissolved and rebuilt on more solid foundations. Pope Alexander VI, despite his moral controversies, provided a masterful example of this synthesis in action. Rodrigo Borgia had systematically eliminated every internal weakness that could compromise his effectiveness while maintaining the ability to abandon any external position when strategic necessity demanded it. His notorious flexibility was not mere opportunism but a sophisticated understanding that survival and success required the freedom to adapt to changing circumstances without being constrained by emotional attachment to previous positions or self-image. Borgia could shift alliances without feeling betrayed or betraying because he had destroyed the part of himself that needed consistency for its own sake. He could abandon strategies that weren't working without experiencing the cognitive dissonance that paralyzes less flexible minds. He could even accept temporary defeats without the despair that destroys lesser leaders because his sense of identity was not dependent on continuous success but on the capacity for continuous adaptation. This synthesis creates what could be called dynamic equilibrium, a state of stability that comes not from rigidity but from the ability to flow with changing circumstances while maintaining core integrity. Like a master martial artist who can yield to force without being overcome by it, the individual who has achieved this synthesis can engage fully with the world without being enslaved by it. The commercial enterprises of Venice provided another laboratory for observing this principle. The most successful Venetian merchants were those who had learned to hold their business interests lightly enough to adapt to changing markets while developing internal capabilities robust enough to create value under any circumstances. They could abandon failing trade routes without emotional devastation because their sense of identity was based on their abilities as traders rather than their success in any particular market. These merchants understood that true security comes not from protecting what you have but from developing the capability to recreate what you need. They invested as much in their own skill development and relationship building as they did in cargo and ships because they recognized that external assets could be lost but internal capabilities could only be taken by death. This insight enabled them to take calculated risks that more attached competitors could not consider, leading to greater long-term success and genuine security. The synthesis also creates a particular approach to relationships that transcends the usual categories of selfish versus selfless behavior. The man who can walk away from any relationship while having destroyed his weak self interacts with others from a position of centered generosity rather than neurotic need. His kindness comes from abundance rather than strategy, his loyalty from choice rather than dependency, his love from fullness rather than emptiness. Such a person becomes paradoxically more attractive to others because he offers the rare gift of unchained affection. People sense intuitively that his regard for them is voluntary rather than compulsory, chosen rather than needed, and, therefore, more valuable than the desperate attachment of the insecure. His ability to walk away makes his choice to stay more meaningful, while his lack of internal weaknesses means his perception of others is not distorted by projection or compensation. In the political realm, this synthesis manifests as what could be called sovereign leadership. The sovereign leader does not need to dominate others because he has already achieved dominion over himself. He does not need to control outcomes because he has developed the capability to adapt to any outcome. He does not need to win every battle because he understands that ultimate victory comes from the capacity to survive and learn from every engagement. Such leaders inspire genuine loyalty rather than fearful compliance because their strength is obvious and their motives are clear. They seek power not to compensate for inner weakness but to express inner strength. They make difficult decisions not from desperate attachment to particular outcomes but from clear assessment of available options. They inspire confidence not through false bravado but through demonstrated capability under pressure. The synthesis also transforms the relationship between the individual and fortune itself. Most people experience life as something that happens to them, alternating between periods of resistance and surrender, control and helplessness. The person who has achieved this synthesis experiences life as something he participates in creating, neither fighting circumstances nor submitting to them but dancing with them. This dance with fortune requires what could be called strategic flexibility combined with tactical precision. The synthesized individual can change direction quickly when circumstances warrant it but commits fully to whatever direction he chooses. He can abandon plans without regret while pursuing current plans with complete dedication. He can prepare for multiple futures while living completely in the present. Cesare Borgia, despite his ultimate failure, demonstrated many aspects of this synthesis during his rise to power. He had eliminated enough of his weak self to make decisions based on strategic assessment rather than emotional reaction, while maintaining enough detachment from any particular outcome to adapt quickly when circumstances changed. His ability to inspire both fierce loyalty and deep fear came from this combination of psychological integration and strategic flexibility. Borgia could form alliances without becoming dependent on them, make promises without becoming enslaved to them, and pursue goals without becoming attached to them. This gave him tremendous freedom of action that more psychologically bound leaders could not match. His downfall came not from a failure of this synthesis but from external circumstances, his father's death, that exceeded even his considerable adaptability. The synthesis creates what could be called metastability, stability at a higher level that enables instability at lower levels. The person who has achieved this synthesis can tolerate tremendous uncertainty and change in his external circumstances because he has achieved certainty about his internal capabilities. He can engage in high-risk activities because he has eliminated the internal weaknesses that turn external setbacks into psychological devastation. This metastability enables what entrepreneurs and innovators would later recognize as optimal risk-taking. The synthesized individual can pursue opportunities that others cannot consider because he is not paralyzed by the fear of loss or the need for guaranteed outcomes. He can experiment, fail, adapt, and try again because his sense of identity and worth is not dependent on any particular result. The military applications of this synthesis were particularly evident in the careers of successful condottieri, the professional military leaders who sold their services to various Italian city-states. The most effective of these commanders had learned to serve their employers loyally without becoming emotionally attached to any particular cause, while developing their military capabilities to such a high level that they remained valuable regardless of political changes. These commanders could shift between employers without feeling like traitors because they had destroyed the parts of themselves that needed ideological consistency for psychological comfort. They could commit fully to each campaign without becoming devastated by defeats because their identity was based on their skills as military leaders rather than their record in any particular conflict. This combination made them both highly effective and highly sought after. The synthesis ultimately points toward a redefinition of strength itself. Conventional strength is often understood as the ability to resist, to hold on, to maintain position despite pressure. The strength that emerges from this synthesis is more like the strength of water, the ability to flow around obstacles, to adapt to any container while maintaining essential nature, to persist through yielding rather than resistance. This redefinition has profound implications for how one approaches every aspect of life. In business, it means building capabilities rather than defending positions. In relationships, it means growing together rather than holding on to each other. In personal development, it means becoming more flexible rather than more rigid. In leadership, it means inspiring voluntary followership rather than demanding compliance. The synthesized individual operates from what could be called principled pragmatism, adherence to core values combined with complete flexibility about methods and tactics. He knows what he stands for but not where he stands, committed to his deepest principles but unattached to any particular expression of them. This enables him to navigate complex situations without losing his way, to adapt to changing circumstances without losing his identity. Perhaps most importantly, the synthesis creates genuine fearlessness. This is not the reckless fearlessness of the person who has not yet encountered real danger, nor the desperate fearlessness of the person who has nothing left to lose. It is the earned fearlessness of the person who has systematically eliminated everything within himself that external forces could use to control him through fear. Such a person can face any threat with equanimity because he has already survived the destruction of his weak self and emerged stronger. He can contemplate any loss with serenity because he has already practiced walking away from everything he once thought he needed. He can confront any challenge with confidence because he has developed capabilities that transcend any particular circumstance. The man who can walk away from everything and has destroyed his weak self becomes, in essence, unconquerable. He cannot be bribed because he is not attached to wealth. He cannot be threatened because he has already faced his fears. He cannot be manipulated because he has eliminated his weaknesses. He cannot be broken because he has already been through the only breaking that matters, the conscious dissolution and reconstruction of his own limitations. This is the ultimate Machiavellian insight. True power comes not from what you can take but from what you cannot be denied, not from what you can control but from what cannot control you, not from what you can gain but from what you cannot lose. In a world where external circumstances remain forever uncertain and dangerous, the only reliable source of security and strength lies in the systematic development of internal invulnerability through detachment and self-mastery. Such individuals become forces of positive change in the world not because they seek to reform others but because they embody the possibilities that others sense but cannot quite grasp. They inspire not through preaching but through example, lead not through domination but through demonstration, and influence not through manipulation but through the magnetic appeal of genuine freedom and authentic strength. The legacy of such a synthesis extends far beyond personal success or survival. Those who achieve this integration become teachers and exemplars for others seeking to escape the prisons of their own attachments and weaknesses. They prove that human beings can transcend the usual limitations of fear, need, and ego to operate from principles of choice, capability, and conscious love. In an age where external circumstances seem increasingly uncertain and threatening, these principles become more rather than less relevant. The ability to adapt quickly while maintaining integrity, to engage fully while remaining free, and to love deeply while walking lightly represents perhaps the highest achievement of human development. It is the promise that Machiavelli glimpsed in the shadows of Renaissance power, that human beings can become truly sovereign, not through dominion over others but through mastery of themselves.